I'm rolling.
All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Doug Lee. It's August 26, 2019. We're at the Portland campus, Linfield College. Thanks so much for joining us today, Doug. We appreciate this. We'll start with a nice background question, which is why history? What about history appealed to you?
I've always loved history since undergraduate at Lewis and Clark College, and enjoy reading. It's just an interesting field.
How did you decide to get into it as a profession?
I was interested in Chinese history because I'm a Chinese American, but also because it wasn't taught in the undergraduate curriculum back in the 60s. And so it was like a forbidden area. So that's instead of European history or Western Civ. So I decided to go into that field.
So tell me about your experience then at Lewis and Clark and then afterwards with getting your education.
I got a master's degree from the University of Michigan in 1969. Then I went in the Air Force for 4 years, and I came back out and got a PhD from UC Santa Barbara in modern Chinese history. And then I went back to law school late in life at Lewis and Clark, graduated in '88 in international law, specializing in high-tech transfer in China.
Interesting. So what prompted that?
Combining my interest in modern China with something more practical. At that time, it was hard to get teaching jobs. And just as I was about ready, I was going to take the bar, Linfield came and offered me a job.
So tell me about your teaching before Linfield. Then what were you? Where else were you teaching after you got your PhD?
I taught at the University of Washington. I taught at Lewis and Clark before I went to law school there, and then Linfield.
And what were you teaching at Linfield?
Linfield, I was the person who was the Asian historian. I taught Japanese history, Chinese history. I taught in the Western culture program, and then I taught special topics courses in Asian history.
Did you find a lot of interested students in Asian history when you came to Linfield?
I did. Yeah.
Was there a particular focus that for them? Was there a certain part of history they were excited about, or a certain region they were excited about?
I would say at that level there wasn't a real specialized interest because, for instance, I offered a course on Middle Eastern history, modern, from the time of the Prophet through the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and people really liked that course a lot too. So they like general survey courses at that level. Yeah.
So you mentioned Linfield offering you a job. What were your experiences like at Linfield? Tell me about why you chose to go there and sort of how you enjoyed your time on campus.
I had never heard of Linfield. Even when I was at Lewis and Clark College, I took no note that Linfield or Willamette, other schools around. I just concentrated on being at Lewis and Clark, but I had friends that had gone to Linfield. And I drove down to McMinnville and met with the people there, and I found it a very, very nice environment. And when I joined the faculty, it was a very positive experience for most of the time. Yeah.
And then what did you do after Linfield?
I was hired by PLU, your football rival. So I taught there for about 5 years.
And now I understand you're at UC Berkeley, is that correct?
Yes, part-time. Because I retired in 2014 after 46 years of teaching.
Pretty good career.
Yeah.
Do you have as you look back at your teaching time, do you have a particular favorite time or favorite topic or favorite class you had that you kind of look back on fondly?
In terms of curriculum and teaching, probably I enjoyed teaching summer school at Portland State because I taught seniors, and I was able to conduct it like a seminar, and we read, more in-depth monographic studies. Whereas at Linfield and other colleges, undergraduates do lecture, and there's not much chance for interplay, dialoguing. So I think I enjoyed that, working with maybe 10 or 12 students in a seminar setting.
And as part of your time at Linfield, you were head of the history department, is that?
Yes, I was.
Tell me about your experience with that.
I was chairman for about 2 years. We had a small department, only 3 people. And Oh, there were some political headaches, to be sure. I really did not want to leave Linfield. I liked it very, very, very much. But there were some political issues in the department, and when PLU offered me a job with a substantial increase in salary, and I was already told that my time at Linfield was limited and I should look elsewhere, so I took the offer. Otherwise, I would have loved to stay at Linfield. I really, really, really loved it. I loved the students. I loved the faculty. I just, in my own department, it became a tempest in the teapot, so it was time to move on. But I have fond memories of Linfield, very fond memories.
So during your time at Linfield, of course, you were present for the Tiananmen Square incident in Beijing. So tell me about why you were there, and then to kind of talk us through the experiences of being there.
Well, when I was teaching at Lewis and Clark a few years before Linfield, I got a call. I was filling in for a colleague who was on sabbatical in Taiwan, and they asked for him, and I said, he's not here, I'm taking his place. And they said, well, would you be interested in lecturing on a cruise ship? It's all paid for. And I said, well, yes. So I lectured on the Pearl of Scandinavia. We either sailed from Kobe, Japan, through the Sea of Japan up to Korea, then over to China, and then on various stops on the coast of China, ending in Hong Kong. Or sometimes we'd go from Japan to Hong Kong and then sail north. That year we sailed into Hong Kong in late May of 1989. And Hong Kong was, the people were demonstrating that year in Hong Kong in support of the students in Tiananmen Square. But it was nowhere near like today in 2019's type of demonstrations. So I happened to be on one of my cruises that summer. There were about 320 people on the ship. The State Department told people that you should not go to China. It would not be a good time to go. So we originally were going to have maybe about 500 people. So a good number of people dropped out. But the people who went had a very memorable experience.
So yeah. I'm going to back up for a second. So who were you lecturing to? Who were the people on the ship?
I was lecturing to the people who were, I guess, paying customers. They were on this cruise, just like you'd go on any cruise, Mediterranean cruise or Caribbean cruise. These cruises were primarily in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and China. And most of the people were, I would say, senior citizen type people. Many of them well-traveled, well-educated, who have an interest. So I was the enrichment lecturer. So I had to give about 4 lectures on the cruise ship on different topics. And then when we get to China, I was part of the crew that went ashore and briefed people. I could give a little bit more, like when we toured the Forbidden City or some places, because I knew the history. I didn't just say, oh, that's a palace, and that's a temple, keep walking. But what temple was it? What was it used for? How does it relate to something else? So that was kind of my extra role.
So tell me about this time getting to China as the events are happening. Kind of take us through your experiences.
Well, we first saw that things were different when we got to Hong Kong. I remember we left Hong Kong in the early evening, around maybe 6, 7:30 at night. And Hong Kong, as you know, is an island, and there's a harbor between the island of Hong Kong and the Kowloon Peninsula. It's one of the deepest harbors in the world. U.S. Fleets from Vietnam used to go there for R&R during the Vietnam War. So we sailed from one end of the harbor to the other end of the harbor. We were going northerly. So we had to sail through the harbor and then out into the ocean. And I remember it's very beautiful, Hong Kong Harbor, like San Francisco Bay or New York, East River and the Hudson River, very beautiful at night. And I was standing next to a gentleman who was traveling with his wife, who's a realtor, and his mother, his 89-year-old mother. And he was a veteran of the Korean War. And he mentioned that the last time he was in Hong Kong was in the Korean War, which is in the early 50s. And we talked about what was going on in Beijing, and the buzz on the ship was, what are we going to see, what's going to happen. It was very kind of surrealistic. The ship is sailing and there's music and people are getting together to go to dinner, and then you see beautiful Hong Kong, but then you know in the distance, far away in Beijing, momentous things are happening. That was, let's see, probably maybe 4 or 5 days. No, maybe longer than that. Maybe this Beijing was the last stop in China. It's probably maybe that was June 4th, was it? Was it June 4th? I think it's June 4th. So we were probably there in May, end of May, and we flew into Hong Kong and spent 2 days there. And I remember attending the demonstrations in Hong Kong Central. Hong Kong Central would be like down near Pioneer Square in Portland, the center of town. And there were these large demonstrations with thousands and thousands of people holding candles, kind of in solidarity with the students in Beijing. And we had word from the U.S. consulate that, it was not too safe to go, but we went anyway. And so as we sailed north, it was kind of with a little bit of foreboding,
And then what happened when you arrived?
Well, usually when you arrive in Beijing, the typical scenario, the schedule is you arrive in the early, you arrive in the early morning and you arrive at a seaport. So it'd be like arriving at Astoria, and you still have to get to Portland. So you take a train from Qinhuangdao. Qinhuangdao is the first emperor of China island. And it's a place where the Great Wall of China goes down into the ocean. It's a little peninsula. And Qinhuangdao, there's a train station, and you take a train into Beijing. I think it must have taken maybe a couple hours. Okay. Well, our arrival was different because we didn't get on the train. They said, well, there's a delay. So they took us on a little sightseeing tour of this place. They showed people where the Great Wall went into the sea, and they took us around. And then, so we didn't get on the train till noon, which is about 5 hours later. And so we're going from noon, and we didn't get to Beijing until about 4. And it was very different because Beijing is a very large city. It's like pulling into New York City or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco. Just huge, huge city. We noticed as we were in the outskirts of Beijing, there were PLA. PLA is the People's Liberation Army. They were olive-colored uniforms with yellow stripes. And we saw on the sides of the track PLA units bivouacking. They were in their tents. They were cooking and they're washing their clothes. They were just camped out along the tracks at stations. And so every station you see a group of these soldiers. Now Beijing Railway Station is like Grand Central. It's multi-level, 4 levels down, and usually it's very crowded because many people go to Beijing, to take care of their business. And usually the train station is very crowded. Of course, the train station in 1989 is not like the new one they have today. The new one they have today looks like an airport. It's so big and so modern. And I think they have 2 in Beijing. So we pulled in the station, we got off the train, and we all had carry-on luggage, and people just had little bags because they left most of the things on the ship. So we had to go up different escalators. But we noticed there was no trains. I mean, for a major train station, there was no activity. And you get up to this huge lobby, and a lobby of a train station is cavernous. And the doors of the front of the station, I would say, are probably maybe 12, 14 feet tall. They're huge doors, and they're in pairs. And they were all chained. And there was nobody in the lobby, which is, we were there at 4:30, 5, it's empty. And we all had to file out 1 pair of doors. Now, in front of the train station are usually where, I wouldn't call them homeless people, but they're people who come into Beijing from the countryside, and that's their place to meet. And they have their baskets and their suitcases, and it's just a hangout place. And usually hundreds of people. Nobody was there. Okay? So we piled on buses, and our group of 320 people were divided into 2 or 3 hotels. Some would go to this hotel, so different buses take you to different hotels. So we stayed at the Kunlun Hotel, which is owned by the People's Liberation Army. And we got on a bus, and as we were driving through Beijing, we saw soldiers. One particular thing that caught my eye was a big intersection. I suppose if it were Portland, it would be like the intersection of maybe 5th and Burnside. Bigger, you know. And there were, in Beijing, they had these old buses with accordion attachments so the bus can turn and the bus bends. They had 2 of these buses, like covered wagons in a circle in the intersection. It reminded me of, wagon train, Ward Bond, the wagon trains get in a circle when the Indians come. And so these buses were in a circle, and it was like an amphitheater. People were staying on the bus and in the bus, and there was some type of talking, speech going on in the middle. So it was very interesting. And I don't know whether it was government or whatever. So it took us a while to get to our hotel, because our hotel was on the other side of the city. And we got to the hotel, it was this 5-star hotel. I go in the lobby, and there's a carpet on the wall that must have been a couple hundred feet by a couple hundred feet. And it was a scene of mountains and things. So we went to our rooms, and then we came down to dinner. And it was a buffet dinner. And in our hotel, there must have been about 100 of us, maybe 120, 150, 1/3 of the group. Okay. We came down to dinner, and so after dinner, we had free time. And Beijing is kind of like very high northern latitude, so it doesn't get dark until 10:30. And so we were there like 8:30. And I said, let's go to the square. Well, all the old people wanted to go to bed because they'd been up since 5:30. Sightseeing here, getting on the train here, getting there, and they just want to go to bed. So at that time, I get to take somebody for free with me when I go. So I took an older lady who was a family friend from Seattle. So she went with me. She's a very adventuresome person. And then there was this minister from England. I think he was a Episcopalian minister. And his wife. So the 4 of us got in a cab, and because I speak Mandarin, no problem. So we went across the city, and I was engaged in conversation with the taxi cab driver, and at first he was mum, didn't want to say too much, didn't know who I was. And after I opened up, and he took us across the city, and Chang'an Boulevard, the Avenue of Everlasting Peace, is very wide. It's kind of like I-5. 4 lanes each side, and it goes right in front of the Forbidden City. You have the Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, and then the squares in front. So as we got closer to that area, denser crowds, and so the car had to inch along because people were all around the car. So I said to him, I knew if I let him go, I'd never get a cab. So I said, I will pay you half. I'll pay you the other half plus a nice tip if you wait. So we drove around, we parked near the Kentucky Fried Chicken with Mao. You can look out the window of the Kentucky Fried Chicken and see Mao. And so the silhouette of Mao and the Colonel makes for an interesting photo op. Then he parked. I said, now you wait, don't go. There's money in it for you. And so we walked down the street and then across the square. And I noticed by this time it must have been about 9. It's still daylight, but it was kind of a beautiful, balmy summer evening, and there are people on their bicycles. And in China, on bicycles, you can fit 4 or 5 people. The driver, somebody on the handlebar, somebody on the back, somebody holding a baby. I mean, it's just like a whole bunch of people. And around the square, there were these high lampposts with globes like grapes, and they were all lit up. And so it was very beautiful. It was balmy, and people relaxed. It was kind of a summer evening. There was no tension. There was no hint of anything. And so we walked around, and then we saw the students. So we walked into where the students were camping. And I was wearing a UCLA t-shirt because I had gone to UCLA for my first year of law school before I transferred to Lewis and Clark. I was lucky to get tuition free because I was on the faculty. So I was wearing a UCLA t-shirt, and the students said, oh, I went to UCLA, and we talked to them, And we walked around, and we saw the Statue of Democracy. And then the minister says, "Oh, we're so tired. It's getting late. It's after 9:30." I said, "Well, we'll come back tomorrow." Not realizing there would be no tomorrow. This is the evening of the third or fourth, before it happened. Evening of the fourth. And so I said, "Okay, we'll go." And so we went back, we traced steps, got in the cab, and then drove back to the hotel. And I gave the guy a big tip. So I felt, okay, so we were back at the hotel, and we didn't think anything wrong. We just kind of all went to our rooms, and I had a room to myself, and I was getting ready. The next day that we were back on schedule. The first day is always you take the group out to the Forbidden City, and you spend from maybe 9 or 10 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. You have lunch, and then from there you go to the Ming Tombs. The Ming Tombs are on a road outside of the north side of the city, and then you go to the Great Wall. So it's the Forbidden City, the Ming Tombs, the Great Wall. It's a one-day trip. And so I was not going to go on that. I've been on it so many times. It's like going to Disneyland for the umpteenth time. You don't want to do it. I was going to visit, at that time there was a Chinese language teacher here at Linfield. I've forgotten her name now. But she and I became good friends. And I was going to see her husband. And she had, I think, a little bag of, I don't know what was in it, but just a little bag, plastic bag with some private things that she wanted to give her husband, maybe some socks or I don't know, whatever. So I called that morning. The bus took off with all 300 plus people, and they were going to be gone all day. So I was going to go visit her husband. He lived near, in the west side of the city, on the other side of the square. The west side of the city is kind of like where the Sorbonne is in Paris, where all the universities are. And so Beijing University, People's University, Renmin Daxue, Beijing Daxue, all the universities are located over there in the western side of the city. So I called to confirm that I was going to meet him that morning around maybe 10:30, 11, whatever. He picked up the phone and you could hear some screaming and yelling, going on. And he says, "Don't come. You can't come. The soldiers are here and they're shooting people. You cannot come. Do not come. Do not come." And he says, "I can't talk. So he hung up. So I didn't know what to do. And so I said, "Well, I'll just go for a walk." And then I found that our hotel compound had been sealed off by the police. So I went back to my room, and then I went out later on the day, and at about 2:30, the buses came back. I said, "Well, why are you back?" And this people got up and said, "Well, the U.S. Embassy sent people around town to tell tourists, go back to your hotels. Go back to your hotels." This is the morning after. I didn't, I forgot something I should have told you. So that night, after I got back to the hotel around 9:30, 10, I went to my room, and I was watching TV, and they only had 3 or 4 channels. One, they were having Molière, the French playwright, his plays translated to Chinese. Another channel, they were teaching geometry. Another channel, there was a lady, you know how they have breaking news, CNN? Okay, so there's a lady sitting there with the Chinese underneath, breaking news. So they must be, because something's going on. I'm sorry I'm so forgetful because I'm skipping ahead. So around midnight, somebody knocked on my door. "Dr. Lee, Dr. Lee, Dr. Lee." And I opened it and I said, what? He said, Did you hear? I said, "No, did I hear what?" He says, "They started killing people in the square. The soldiers are there, the tanks are there, they're killing people." I said, "No, I didn't know." And they didn't know I'd been down there a few hours earlier. So, well, thank you for telling me. So that's when I turned on the TV and saw the algebra and the Moliere, and I turned to the state channel. Well, they're all state channels. It's all state-run TV. But I turned to one channel, and so I was waiting for the lady to speak, and she never spoke. And then it went dark. So I turned to CNN News out of Atlanta, and they had the whole thing. They were saying, "Oh, the news out of Beijing, we have reports of this is happening," and then they, I guess they must have spliced it or got something with Ted Koppel, ABC News. So I got a little bit of that. So it was then that I knew what had happened, and I wrote a poem later on that morning. So then it was the next day that I saw the group off to go to the trip, and then I found out I couldn't go meet my person at the west side of the city. So I was there, and that's when they came back. So now we're cut back, looped around. So around 2:30, 3 o'clock, the bus pulls up, people getting out, and I said, "Well, you should be leaving for the Ming Tombs right now. Why are you here?" And then they said, "Well, U.S. Embassy people told us we have to leave. We can't go on a tour. Tour's canceled." We came back. We're at the hotel. So we all gathered in some big ballroom, and they made the announcement that the trip to Beijing is canceled. We're leaving the next morning, around 6 in the morning, and we would be sailing to Korea. And so, gee, we all felt disappointed, but at least we were safe. The next morning we got up, and I remember having breakfast, and then we got on the bus. There was this couple, a very memorable couple. He was the manager of the Grand Casino in Monte Carlo in Monaco. And his wife, I think it was his second or third wife, trophy wife, blonde hair and very voluptuous. But they were kind of prima donnas. They just felt entitled. Everywhere they go, they were first, and if the cities like Shanghai, they would be told, "Okay, we're going to this factory, be back on the bus in 25 minutes." They would come back in 45 minutes, and they would shop for rugs, shop for closet bases, and we all got annoyed with them because they felt so entitled. Well, on this morning, they really were too much. They always felt that the two front seats next to the driver were their seats. And I had a couple people who sat there and they had fights because they thought that was their seat. And, il parle français souvent, they only spoke French, and this and that. And so this morning, we pulled up to an intersection. And again, it's a 4-lane, it was kind of like a freeway, but not a major freeway. It had cars, and so there were tanks on the overpass, and they were, so the bus had to come to a stop. Soldiers came on board. Well, this lady is taking pictures, clicking, and I said, "Ma'am, you put away your camera. You should not be taking pictures of the tank." The turd come over, point at the bus, and we were frightened. And then her lens cover, which was attached with a little leather thing, fell off and fell down the stairs and out the door. So she wanted to get up and get it, and said, "No, don't get up and get it. You just forget it." And then the guide on the bus behind us jumped out, picked up the lens, threw it in the door. They closed the door, and we were off. And we're racing to the airport, and we're going through some narrow streets through small parts of town. And the street couldn't have been more than 9 feet wide. So if you put your hand out the window, you'd be hitting awnings. But we saw people standing like this, like Richard Nixon. And we got to the airport. Again, it was deserted. It's a kind of reverse of when we got there. So we were finally on the train. Of course, the train didn't leave for another hour. But other trains started coming in. And so we'd yell across the tracks, "Have you heard?" "No, we haven't heard. What happened?" And we would say, "No, they didn't believe us." And then the people who came on the train, the people who push carts with peanuts and popcorn and beads, and we tried to engage them, and they wouldn't say anything. "Did you about last night?" Mayo. Mayo doesn't mean mayo like mayonnaise. It means no. And so nobody would say anything. And so by about 11 in the morning, 11:30, we're rolling through the countryside. It was a beautiful sunny day like today, and nothing happened. But one of the persons in our group was this guy. He claimed to be from Purdue University, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think he was CIA because on the ship he had a private room and he had makes your camera look like you have a brownie there. He had so many cameras, so much stuff, and he was very mysterious. We didn't see him in the trip. He was in the square all night long. And he was on the truck talking to the students, and the lights started to, he told us later on, the lights started to flicker, and the students told him, get down from the truck, get down from the truck. The lights have never flickered, never flickered. Something's going to happen. This is our battle, not yours, so you get out of here, you get out. He wouldn't leave. So he was there clicking, and I said, how did you do that? He says, I was just worried about my light meter, and I was worried about this, and the lens, and so he took like 4 rolls of film. He came back to the hotel. I dropped one off at like CBS or ABC. Then he stuck a couple of cold cream jars, and he was very conspicuous. And he was giving all kinds of interviews. So when we left that morning, we got off the bus at the train station. He was stopped. He didn't have the sense. He got a banner from the students, and the banners were usually on bamboo poles with like a sheet or a cloth stapled, and he rolled it up. It had blood all over it. If I were him, I would detach it from the poles, fold it up, put it in plastic. I put it in my suitcase and keep my mouth shut. We used to go around showing people the banners, and so the police stopped him, confiscated the banners, and then when the train got to the train station, then you take a bus to the dock. And docks in China are like airports. Like you have to go through TSA. Okay, so not anybody can get to a dock to get on a ship. And so he was stopped again, and frisked again, and held. But we all got on the ship. Then we got on the ship, we sailed, and the first stop in Korea, he was mobbed by reporters. And then later on, I said to him, would you like to get some of your footage? I teach, and I could use this at Linfield, blah, blah, blah. And he told me when I called him about a couple months later that his house had been robbed. They stole it, they ransacked it. Fortunately, he had left off some film with some news reporters, but I still think he was CIA. So that's my adventure.
You mentioned the students calling it their fight and encouraging him to stay. Did you get a sense for what people who were not involved in it thought about what the students are doing versus what where their loyalties lie?
Well, I didn't talk to very many Chinese private people because there wasn't time, there was no opportunity. But when I went back in January, and I've been back to China maybe 10 times since then, every time I go back, even today, people don't want to talk about it in public. They don't want to be seen talking to a foreigner or anybody about it, but they will talk in private. And the consensus then, and still I think pretty popular with most people today, is that the students in 1989, they had maybe a good cause, because there was nepotism, there was corruption, influence peddling. People in the Communist Party and the government had privilege. They could shop at special stores. Not like today, freewheeling. In those days, they had nice stores that only foreigners and government officials could shop in. So if you wanted to buy Johnny Walker liquor, or buy a nice bicycle, or buy something nice, you had to be either a foreigner or a Chinese official. And the average person couldn't go in these places. So there was a sense of, it's not fair. And young people, especially in 1989, many of them had gone abroad for schooling. Many of them had opportunities because the colleges and universities were closed during the Cultural Revolution. So this was the first generation is benefiting from the new China opening up in the wake of Nixon visit. And this is like 89 is Carter normalized relations in 78, so this is a decade later, so it's a different China. And there's a discrepancy between all the hype of how China's changing, the promises, the rising expectations, but you have failed expectations. You have young people getting married, but just have to live with their parents in a one-bedroom apartment. you have 4 people plus a baby in a 1-bedroom apartment, because housing is very limited. They didn't have the building boom they would have in the 90s. So it was a difficult time, and I could understand that. But the older generation, people I would say who were around during the Cultural Revolution, felt that these young people were spoiled. They did not appreciate what happened in China when they were babies. The deprivation, the political repression. This China of the late 80s, early 90s was a marvelous place. Colored TVs, people could have motorcycles, people could have an air conditioner. The standard of living was going up. Of course, it's not like today, but it was changing. And it was felt that they are biting the hand that feeds them. They don't appreciate all the wonderful things that are happening, and they complain, and they're making trouble for all of us. So there was a sense of resentment. And while it was regrettable that they were killed, but in some ways they brought it down on themselves. Most Chinese people, I don't think it's just in communist China, I think most Chinese people are not politically inclined, because politics has always been for other people. And it's like putting your hand on iron. You touch a hot iron, you'll never touch an iron again, even if it's cold. So there's a reluctance, there's an aversion to politics and getting involved in politics, because no good can come of it. There's always going to be an emperor. There's always going to be somebody in charge, and there's little or nothing you can say except bring hell down on you and your family. So even today, most Chinese, what the government says, it's like how we used to think in the United States before the Vietnam War. Well, if the president said so, it must be true. Remember when Eisenhower? But since Johnson and Nixon, if the president says it, well, you have to second guess it, especially today with our current president. So I think the political culture is very different in China. So even today, if you go to China, no one talks about Hong Kong. And presumably nobody knows, because the government controls the media. But there's social media, people know, but they don't talk about it, because it's not safe to do that. And in China, the one thing that China has done that Gorbachev failed to think about when he was in power, and maybe to some extent Putin, is that I can oppress you politically and make life hard for you, but as long as I give you the goodies, the consumer goods, a minimum of personal freedom, then you're happy. But if I don't give you toilet paper and vodka, then you're doubly unhappy, you see? So the Chinese have delivered on keeping Chinese people happy with consumer goods, a lifestyle they could never have imagined. And so the price you pay is, okay, so I can't speak about politics. Well, if I'm making money, I don't care about politics. So that's their perspective today, But the people in Hong Kong, of course, are quite different. They want their democracy, they want their freedom. They've had the money, they've had the consumer goods, but they want the democracy. So Hong Kong is a very different place. The political culture is different. So
I'm going to come back and ask you about that in a second, but I'm curious. You said you were back in Beijing the next year,
yes,
in January. So tell me about that trip back.
Well, Frank Nelson, you remember Frank Nelson?
Mm-hmm.
Is he related to you?
No.
Okay. Well, he was. I believe he's passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Has he passed away? He was a very, very good person. He asked me if I would like to take a group to China in January. I said, oh, okay, fine. So I took, this is like my third group to China. And we went to China, and we went to Tiananmen Square. And you could see where the tanks had damaged the pavement. But it was so different. No one would talk about it. There's it never happened. It never happened. And of course, I took my students around and I told them what I saw, and I took them places, but it was very surrealistic, very, very different.
No memorials, nothing like that.
No memorial, no mention, no. And we went, of course, it was also very different. We went in December. And December in Beijing versus June is like being in Alaska. December and June are very different. Yeah.
So tell me about your study of since Tiananmen Square and your continuing study and teaching of history. How has that changed how you teach or what students are interested in topics of Chinese history?
Well, I teach two types of courses on China. I teach Chinese history courses, Imperial China, Nationalist China, seminars on Ming history or Qing history. But I also teach a course called Political Economy of China. And I think there's a great deal of interest in that. When you talk about the political economy, the foreign relations, the economic policy modernization, how they deal with social issues. So that is very interesting. People really are interested in that today. Yeah, that's what I'm doing primarily in my retirement at Berkeley and other schools. I teach courses on political economy of China rather than history.
How would you say that in the 30 years since Tiananmen Square, how has the story about the events changed, or has it changed? Is it still roughly thought of the same way, or has the narrative changed a little bit?
I would say it's essentially the same. China's in a time warp. I mean, in one sense, so much time has passed, and these events are so far back then. I suppose it's like in America. When I was growing up, World War II was so far away, and I was born after World War II. And now I'm feeling the Vietnam War has taken the place of World War II. It's something that young people today, it's in the history books. We live through it, but for them it's history. And in China, so many hundreds and hundreds of millions of people were born since Tiananmen Square, and it's not in the history books. So it's only in the history of people's living memories. So in families, they might talk about it. Oh, your uncle was at the square, 30 years ago, and now your uncle is 70 years old, and he probably doesn't want to talk about it. Those that really were involved, really had a very active role in it and still are concerned about it as an issue, have left China. They live in Canada, the United States, they're dissidents. And part of this issue with Hong Kong is that the law they wanted to pass was to extradite people, to take them back to mainland China should they say too much or criticize the government in Hong Kong. And even we as foreigners, if we are too loose with the lips in Hong Kong, they could hustle you off. So that's why this extradition law was opposed so strenuously by the demonstrators. But no, I suspect that as history, it's still erased. It's like when the pharaohs of Egypt died and the successor didn't like what they did, they erased all the monuments, the hieroglyphics. The Chinese government has done a nice job of scrubbing down, cleaning, sanitizing history. But something like this that happened even so long ago, you can't entirely get rid of it. It will be there, even in bits and pieces. And so it remains to be seen what will happen. 30 years in Chinese history is a blink of an eye. Even a multi-millisecond blink is very short time. So we don't know what will happen in the decades to come. Yeah.
Tell me about, on a personal level, as a Chinese American, as a Chinese scholar, as someone who was there, what the events mean to you personally, as you look back on being there for that.
Well, personally, it was nice to be there. I felt very exciting, I suppose, for people who were in Berlin when the Berlin Wall came down. I mean, you're there when history's occurring, and so that's very significant. And as a student of history, you appreciate it even more because to the people in my group who were there, they were excited, but they didn't have the historical context. It was being at some big event. It was like being in New York City when the year 2000 came and you saw the fireworks. Oh, I lived the millennium, But as a student of history, I had a sense of appreciation of how it fit in Chinese history, Chinese political history. So I appreciated that. Now it's been 30 years. I've changed. I've gotten older. I'm disappointed that it's being somewhat forgotten. It's probably being better remembered, better documented in the West. says what you. I mean, Linfield College is not Harvard, or Princeton, or Cal, but even a small college, you have an interest in it. So in the West, it's being kept alive, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Yeah.
So let's talk about current events a little bit, since you brought it up a couple of times today, and obviously it's in the news right now. So tell us, again, from your perspective, your historical perspective, about the events in Hong Kong and how they sort of parallel what happened.
Well, in 1982, the Thatcher government, Prime Minister of the UK, she negotiated an agreement with China with regard to the future of China. In 1981-82, the colonial government of Hong Kong, they leased blocks of property in the new territories for 20-year leases. And they said, we can't give out any more leases because we don't know. 1997 midnight, July 1st, 1997, is 99 years since they got the lease. Now, Hong Kong has three parts to it. It's kind of like metropolitan Portland, and then you have Clackamas and Washington, okay? So Hong Kong is really three pieces that were put together at three different points in time. The island was given to Britain as a result of a war in 1842. Then the peninsula across the harbor was given to Britain in 1868. Then the new territories, which would be the bulk of a colony, which is the peninsula, it gets wider as you go in, and it comes to a point, and then the island. So the island and the little peninsula, but then there's a huge 2/3 of the colony, which is land that goes right up to China. That was leased back in the end of the 19th century. So the lease was up. So the Thatcher government told the Chinese, well, this is British land and we're going to have it forever. And the Chinese government reminded it, well, you have the island and you have the peninsula, but you don't have the new territories. And the new territories is important because it's a supply of fresh water, it's a place where manufacturing occurs. So there's a lot of things happen there that tourists don't see, because they're over here. It's like when you go to San Francisco, you go to Fisher's Wharf or Chinatown or downtown, but you don't go out to the avenues or whatever. So the Chinese government notified the British government that China had for a long time considered Hong Kong when they were going to take it back, but at an appropriate time. There was talk if they might take it back after World War II, they might take it back after the Communist Revolution in '49, they might take it back during the Cultural Revolution, but every time the Communist leadership said it's not yet the right time. So they figured when the lease is up, that's a good time. And so the Chinese government told the British government, not only we were taking back the new territories, which is technically the only land that we're entitled to, but under our view of international law, we believe that you stole the other two pieces. So we're taking it all back. And if you want to do something about it, try. So Britain was forced to negotiate with the Chinese government. So they came up with an agreement between London and Beijing that said that they will keep Hong Kong as an autonomous region. It will be returned legally to China, but it will be an autonomous region. Like the Canal Zone was for the Panama Canal, that is kind of an internationally recognized area for 50 years. For 50 years. So that means in 2047 or something like that, when I'm 102, Hong Kong will no longer have that status. But under that agreement, they are allowed to have their own political, economic, educational, social, cultural institutions. And the Chinese government may not interfere. They have to they have their own flag of Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is under China's control, so Beijing handles Hong Kong's foreign relations. And the Chinese government does have stationed troops in barracks, the former British barracks, but they never come out. They can't do, it's like we have a law in the United States that the military can't do police activity in the United States. I think this has come up when we talk about the southern border. So as a result of this, the people of Hong Kong had a great deal of freedom and democracy compared to mainland China. And they've always been very unhappy with any effort of Beijing to alter that agreement. But now the agreement's been enforced since '82, and it became official in '97. It's 219. Now the Chinese government can, with impunity, declare it null and void and do whatever it wants, and nobody can stop them. Britain can't stop them. The UN can't stop them. It's an internal matter. The only reason why the Chinese government has not intervened and taken over Hong Kong and canceled the agreement is because you don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Hong Kong is very valuable. And now with the Trump tariffs, the Chinese economy is slowing down. And this is not a good time to also add to headache of putting too much control or exerting too much pressure on Hong Kong. So they're doing it indirectly through the government of Hong Kong. The chief executive is a Hong Kong resident, but she's appointed by Beijing. And she's effectively the mouthpiece of Beijing. So Beijing wants something, she complies. And they want her to pass this extradition law, which they haven't. And this has emboldened the protesters, like the ones in Tiananmen Square in 1989. They are emboldened to ask for more. So they want her resigned. They want the extradition law gotten rid of, not just tabled, gotten rid of, and they want several other things. And so Beijing is feeling pressure. So Beijing is in a very difficult position today. If they do, they're damned, and if they don't, they're damned. So they have troops on the other side of the border in Shenzhen. I think that there may come a time where they're going to cross the border with tanks, but they're going to head straight for the barracks. And just going from Shenzhen into Hong Kong, through Hong Kong, and into the barracks is enough to frighten everybody. So I think they will be restrained in the sense they won't do what Deng Xiaoping did in Tiananmen Square and start killing people. Because I think killing people in Hong Kong would be a catastrophe in the making, a PR catastrophe for China. They can't afford that. But just showing the force will be enough, you know?
Is it possible for your students to fully grasp like what it is to be a citizen of China for history?
Well, I think in a larger, broader rubric, I think students in American universities and colleges, so they take history courses, political science courses, international relations, we know there are places like North Korea, places like Iran, places like Russia, places like China, and we know there are different political systems. I think this is well known even to the general public. But I think what Americans and most Westerners don't understand is the political culture and also the high culture, the values. For instance, in places like Korea, places like China, in East Asian societies, they have a whole different set of values. Here we prize individuality, we prize autonomy, we prize Bill of Rights. But in China, those don't exist. In Chinese society, you don't have rights. You have duties, you have obligations. You have obligation to love your country, to serve your country. You don't have, the Constitution provides for all the rights. They have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of grievance, subject to the security of the country. So that's like what they were going to say to the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, give me your poor, if they can stand on their own 2 feet. So it's like a little footnote. So for Chinese people, you can have freedom of the press, you can have freedom of religion within certain constraints. You can go to mass, you can go to a mosque, you can go to a Buddhist temple, but if you're Falun Gong and you start to criticize the government, that's a no-no, you see. So in that sense, I think that American students or Western students more generally don't appreciate the subtleties of culture and language. As I was saying to people when I took them to tours of the Forbidden City, tonight you're going to sleep better than the Emperor of China because you're in a 5-star hotel. The rug in the elevator says, good morning, it's Friday. And you have air conditioning, you have a buffet to go to. Well, the Emperor of China didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have toilet paper. So if you're in a third world country, you don't miss air conditioning, but you've never had it. Well, you don't miss democracy, but you've never had it. In that sense, it's not propaganda to say that democracy is an illusion. It's something that they have, works for them, but it wouldn't work for us. And there's some truth to that. I'm not advocating that. But their notion of democracy, they have the word democracy, they define it, but the way it it materializes in Chinese society or North Korean society is very different than Western society. The China's called the People's Republic of China. Now Taiwan is called the Republic of China, 中华民国. But in China, it's 中华人民共和国, meaning the People's Republic. So there's this kind of idea that we're more democratic than even the Republic of China, but they're really less democratic. But they say they're more democratic. So, well, how does that square with what we believe in this country? You know, there are some Americans who say, in this country, how democratic are we? I mean, if you look at the left wing of the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, the top 1%, the corporations, do we really have democracy? You know, who's pulling the strings? You see, so it depends on how you look at it. Yeah, we learn about ourselves when we study other countries. I feel like I'm teaching a class.
So the last question I have for you, and then we'll see if anybody else has one to follow up. I'm just curious, for you personally, you're semi-retired, you're still teaching. What's next for you? What else are you working on right now? What are you looking forward to?
I've been recently diagnosed with terminal cancer. I have lung cancer, but I'm on gene therapy. It's good. I have tumors disappearing, and look at me, I'm active, so I'm very grateful because I know that a lot of people would be in a worse situation. So I'm kind of, my bucket list is I'm trying to get several books published and enjoy every day and part-time teach now and then. And I feel very lucky. But I don't have any long-range plans, you know.
Good, I'm glad you got always a positive outlook.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
What are the books about?
Oh, yes. Books. What are the books about?
I started writing introduction to my dissertation 30 years ago. To the book, the dissertation became a book. That introduction has had babies. So now it's 6 volumes. Each volume is about 400 pages. And they're lined up like planes on a runway waiting to taxi down the runway. I'm hoping that my first book with the University of Washington Press may come out next year. We're negotiating now. The Cantonese, they're all in Cantonese history. Cantonese are people from Hong Kong, from that part of China. The first volume is Searching for Tongsan. Tongsan is like how the Irish people might refer to Ireland as the Emerald Isle. Okay? So Searching for Tongsan, what it meant to be Cantonese in the 19th century. So that's, hope it comes out, and I'll visit you again.
You guys have anything else you want to ask? All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories today and for telling us about yourself and what's going on. And I think we all learned a lot. I know I did.
Well, thank you.
We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Okay.
Thank you.